Welcome to What Makes Up Your Mind? Updates from the frontiers of neuroscience, well-being, and mental health from the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University's School of Medicine. This is your invitation to meet the faculty dedicated to understanding our most complex organ, committed to curing mental illness, and inspired to help create a healthier, thriving world. It's good to have you back with us on What Makes Up Your Mind. I'm Jane McMillan. In this episode, we arrive at the intersection of culture, religion, and mental health. After hearing from our expert, Stanford Clinical Professor of Psychiatry, Dr. Rania Awaad, you're likely to agree this is a significant meeting place for holistic well-being. Now, medicine and the practice of psychiatry, it's a science. But we feel the effects of mental wellness or disruption at the very center of our emotional selves. We might say we feel it in our hearts and our souls. And so, Dr. Awaad believes that religious and cultural customs should be welcomed into the realm of personal mental healing. While she applies this inclusion for any patient's theology or philosophy, Dr. Awaad's specialty is caring for the Muslim community, integrating modern psychiatry into an ancient and beautiful Islamic tradition of spirit, mind, body health. Among many titles and accomplishments, Dr. Awaad is director of Stanford's Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, associate division chief of Public Mental Health and Population Sciences, and also an affiliate Stanford University chaplain. I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Rania Awaad to What Makes Up Your Mind. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Tell us about this big topic, cultural psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, mental health, and how the heritage of religion and specifically Islam is all brought together in your work. What do you mean by cultural mental health?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll tell you that this is something cultural and mental health, cultural psychiatry hasn't been the most popular topic until more recently. In fact, I would say when I was first training, there was a lot of a number of naysayers who felt like this didn't really belong in the field, coming from a very biological, empirical perspective of what psychiatry means and how it is that the way we practice needs to be very, quote, scientific. And what I always found really interesting is that, we claim that this field of mental health is meant to be very holistic. We should bring, all aspects of a person, all their identities should be present in the psychotherapy room. But somehow culture and religion, especially religion, would seem to always fall off the wagon, if you will. So for me, what this has meant is I come from a Muslim background, and before I went into medicine in my adolescence and in my early 20s, I was doing a lot of personal growth and started to spend a lot of time in the Muslim world, figuring out who I wanted to be and who I was, And in the process of that, really benefited from spiritual guides and mentors. Faith became very important to me, something that I spent a lot of time studying. And so when I entered into the field of mental health, hoping to help my own community, it just felt like it was really lacking. There was really a very little discussion on being able to bring your whole self into the room, including anything that was important to you, if that happened to be faith or your culture, if there are ways that you coped, from your traditions, just wasn't really present. So for me, the field has really grown a ton and expanded a ton. And we're now able to really talk very clearly about the importance of all these aspects for a person's well-being.
Certainly, religious beliefs can be a huge support, and cultural tradition can be a huge support. I'm guessing it can also be a little bit limiting in terms of perhaps guilt or punitive
Right?
concerns or of self-forgiveness. And that's not just in Islam, where I'm talking about any structure of belief, any system of belief. So in your work of combining and applying religious principles to clinical mental health, how do you juggle that? And specifically, the Islamic principles,
Yeah.
how do those aid in your work
For the first part of the question, I just want to reiterate absolutely that there is such a thing as religion that heals and religion that harms. And I think that's very important. In fact, some of the reasons why a person may seek out a person like myself, who they see as somebody from within, practicing themselves a specific religious tradition, and I have a lot of people who self select to come see me who are from Muslim backgrounds. It's very interesting. Sometimes they're seeking me out because I have that familiarity of their culture, of their tradition. And sometimes it's actually the opposite. It's that they have been hurt deeply by a specific community, or their experience has been a negative one. So either they don't want to see someone from the same background, or sometimes they do because they're trying to heal and understand. And I think that's very important. I want to just make sure and put that out there, that as a psychiatrist, I'm not here to cheerlead on religion and faith, but rather to help people make sense of the nuances, both positive and negative, positive coping mechanisms, negative coping mechanisms that they've used and or learned from their upbringing, from their traditions, and so on. So yes, guilt, shame are definitely things we talk about often in the work that I do. And then your question about, how is it to integrate some of these principles and why is it important in the first place? For so many people from faith backgrounds, not just Muslim backgrounds, but really, I do a lot of work in the field of subfield of psychiatry that's called RNS, religion and spirituality. And I work very closely with other colleagues of mine throughout the country who come from different faith traditions. And they're so important because for people from faith communities, very often they're either coping from mechanisms within their faith. And when you exclude that, and there's this quote that says, in modern Western therapy, people feel that they have to, quote, check God at the door before they go into therapy. And that's very difficult for someone from a faith background who they come from a God centered worldview. And now that's been cut from them. And they can't, whatever the therapist or psychiatrist is trying to say to them seems very distant and not very super useful because their way and their worldview isn't quite incorporated. Or sometimes it's even demeaned or looked down upon or frowned upon. So that's very hard, or judged. That's another thing that I hear very often. People from certain faith traditions say, when I bring up the fact that my culture or my family tradition is that we're very collectivist in our way of looking, multiple stakeholders that are making decisions, whereas Western therapy is very individualistic. And it's like, I'm talking to you, the one person in the room, and you make the decision. But that person's saying, I have this whole group of multi generations of my family that need to make these decisions with me. And when I can't do that, or I'm hesitating in the therapy room, I'm getting judged, right? So,
Ah,
this is why these principles become very important to bring in for people from different backgrounds.
does that mean for you that you find therapy most effective when the therapist has a similar background, or is that not necessary?
Oh, that is a hot debate in the field. The field of cultural psychiatry, there's this hot debate on what we call matching. And there's really mixed reviews. There are some people who feel very strongly about the concept of matching. I'm the chief here at Stanford of our diversity clinics, and which has 6 different subclinics within it, and all of them are identity-based clinics. And the reason we did this is because our intake office would receive so many requests of people saying, let's say, I'm a Black identified male who's looking for a Black identified male therapist or
Hmm.
psychiatrist, like very specific like that, you know? And so at that point, you want to help the person with what they're looking for. Now, the other side of the flip of the coin, let me flip the coin. The other side of the debate is that, well, sometimes there could be over familiarity or people assuming that, the same things when actually, even if people are from the same background, same culture, no two people are alike or have the same experience of that culture or faith, let's say. And so there's always some untangling that needs to happen. But here, what we do is we allow the person, the patient really, to take the lead on what their needs are. And then luckily we have a big enough clinic that we can we can shift things around to where maybe actually it's better that you see a person from a different background, but still is very sensitive to your culture and your faith and respectful of it.
The sifting and sorting to find the right therapist in any situation, and the commitment to stick with it until one does, certainly adding the element of culture and religion and life experience. I can see why that is another added complication, I guess, but not in a negative way. It's another layer.
Right.
And then there's the problem of not enough providers in general.
Yes, the pipeline, exactly. Yes. There's the numbers in general of our field, and then there's the pipeline of those who are minority identified clinicians. I personally, people ask me all the time, why do I run my lab, the Muslim mental health and Islamic psychology lab? Within it, I have a pathways program, basically a pipeline program for those who are Muslim identified and want to potentially go into the fields of psychology, psychiatry, or any of the mental health fields, social work, marriage, family therapy, and so on, or even the social sciences, but they touch on mental health. I wished that when I was going through training that I had the kind of mentors that understood what I'm talking about, this cultural, faith-based kind of mentorship. So when I joined the faculty, I said, that's it. I'm starting this Pathways program so that there is a platform for those who are interested in integrating Muslim principles for Muslim patients going forward.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Before we talk about your work in current day, I was fascinated with the previous talk you did and then rereading about it and planning for our conversation today, the historical roots of mental health in the Islamic heritage, treating it, recognizing it, honoring it, long before it became something cared for in the West.
Absolutely. This is like my favorite topic.
Oh, good. It to me. It's just it was a big eye opener for me, having been raised in the Western tradition. I didn't learn about. I learned about the Dark Ages in Europe, and I learned about the Age of Enlightenment. But what you taught me through your work has been an entirely different world.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things too that we're trying to address in this field of RNS, religions and spirituality. And it's that, you go to your psychiatry training. I went through my entire psychiatry training at Stanford, excellent training. Never once did I hear anything about forget the Muslim tradition, any other civilization and their contributions to the field. It's taught from a very Eurocentric point of view. And that only really starts around the 18th century, mostly 19th century. So, for the work that I was looking at, and honestly, I was talking earlier about my personal journey. So it really was a very personal journey because I too was trying to contend with having raised with a lot of, in a community and individuals who were excellent, wonderful people, but they had a lot of stigma towards mental health. And the stigma was Western mental health, is what I came to understand and discover. And part of it is kind of this lack of having faith and religion and God as part of the model of healing. And so I started asking myself, well, what did the early Muslims have to say about this? What did the tradition say about all of this? And that's what led me into these very early texts that you're referring to. The one that the paper I think that you're referring to is what's now become kind of a landmark paper. I'm very humbled by that. But it's about a ninth century Muslim scholar who, as I'm reading his manuscript, translated as the sustenance of the body and soul. That's the translation of his manuscript. And his name is Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. And he's in the ninth century. And he's a physician who's writing about what the modern, this is my paper, I was basically saying as a modern trained psychiatrist reading from the ninth century, I was blown away by the fact that every one of his chapters was essentially a specific psychiatric disorder. So, depression, anxiety, and the one that really tripped me out that I then wrote this paper about was obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. And we had just taken a lecture by, and this person becomes very important in the story. Basically, at the time was, the main author of all the OCD books out there, Dr. Lauren Karan, who was our lecturer in my Stanford psychiatry program, and he had just given this lecture where he said OCD is a modern illness only discovered in the 19th century, and he lists out the people that discovered it and this and that. He said, oh, there was this one reference maybe in an early text in like nothing earlier than the 16th century. And at the same time, I was on my own little journey reading and found this manuscript from the 9th century. And al-Balkhi literally describes OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, in all of the symptoms. I took out the DSM, the Manual to Re-diagnose Psychiatric
Yes.
Disorders, and I put al-Balkhi's criteria side by side with the DSM-5's criteria that had just been published. And Balkhi literally figured it out point by point. Every single point was there. And not only the symptomology, but the correct classification and also the correct diagnosis and treatment. So he literally describes exposure therapy in detail and how to do this, which is our gold standard treatment, and also talks about the importance of taking medication and the importance of having faith. So
That's it's just incredible to me.
it's mind blowing, mind blowing. And it's a great story. I actually end up knocking on Dr. Kron's door and say, I think I found something from the ninth century. And at first, at first he too was kind of like in disbelief. He's like, I've read all the textbooks. And I said, yes, but can you read in Arabic? And he kind of paused and said, no, can you? And I said, yes. And so he said, okay, well, translate that for me and come back. And so I did. And he said, this must be published in, mainstream psychiatric academic journals. This must be cited from here on out. And it was really just the tip of the iceberg. That Belkhi discovery then led to so many other understandings and discoveries. It led to my current book that I just finished writing on the institutions of healing, the hospitals in the Muslim civilization that start even earlier, literally from the advent of Islam. So we're talking 7th century, 8th century onwards, that had psychiatric wards. And that doesn't show up in other hospitals and other civilizations before the Muslim.
And psychiatric wards for treatment and cure, not for isolation, as we've come to
Absolutely.
know, let's say in the Victorian era or
Yes, talking very forward thinking. There was inpatient units and outpatient units. There was this concept of very holistic mind, body, soul. Treatment is really what you find in these treatment centers called the Maristans. And that's what the title of the book is, the Maristans. We traveled all around the country kind of visiting. There's only so many still standing institutions that you can visit. They become like museums and historical buildings. But what's so impressive about them is, for anyone who thinks of Islamic world, think of all of the architecture is very beautiful. It has all very geometric patterns. It's really meant to be soothing. They always have a fountain in the middle. The sound of water, the greenery, the making sure that there was an incorporation of nature. The team was very multidisciplinary, so not just the physician and the nurse, but also a dietitian. There was also a person who was the pharmacologist, basically, who was compounding the medications, and an on-site pharmacy. There's also, so there's medications definitely, but then there's also music therapy. And we've written a number of papers now on the use of music therapy for psychiatric healing, right? And that was very powerful and important. The use of sound, the use of color, the spiritual as well. So there's also what today might be the modern day equivalent of a chaplain, right? That's part of this multidisciplinary team taking care of the psychiatric patients. And this is all early, 8th century, 9th century. And as soon as they start in the Muslim world, they spread everywhere throughout the Muslim world. So, you think about the Middle East, but then actually Islam spreads geographically in different regions. So all through North Africa, all through Asia, Southeast Asia, into on this side, into Spain, into Europe. So you see kind of like wherever Islam spreads, this becomes kind of a trademark, landmark institution, just like mosques or just like the madrasas, which are schools. You see also the maristans.
how was this lost? Or maybe it wasn't lost to the Arab speaking, Arab reading world. Maybe that's just a
Right.
Western view. So,
You're right on. You're
okay.
right on. That's exactly it. This is why in my writings early on I made this mistake, but I came to learn, and why I no longer use the term golden age, because the term, and many people kind of understand, okay, there was this Islamic golden age of all this advancement of science and the mathematics and the humanities and so on. But then the term also implies that there was a decline. In reality, that's a very Eurocentric view of what happened in the Muslim world. And a lot of Muslim scholars will tell you that's not actually what happened. As the seat of power in the Muslim civilization was moving from region to region, you see kind of that continual growth depending on where geographically the seat of power at the time was. So the last of the large Muslim civilizations and dynasties was the Ottoman Empire. And this is why today what ends up being modern day Turkey has the latest or newest of the Maristans. The earlier ones in Cairo, for example, in Egypt, they're still there, but they're much older. So it's not like there was this sharp decline. It was actually just kind of moving throughout the regions.
these early principles and practices of mental health and holistic healing, this comes from the teachings of Islam. Am I correct in that? The tradition of Islam.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tell us about how you are using those now to perhaps overcome any cultural hesitations about what's seen as Western psychiatry or therapy.
Yeah. It's amazing that when I look at the origins, even writers like Balkhi or others who are writing on these topics, when you look at what they're referencing as their inspiration, kind of like the impetus for why they created their hospital, like we wrote some papers on Razi, Razi, Abu Bakr Razi, and he's a little bit later than Balkhi. He's basically his student and onwards. And you could see very clear that they were quoting the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that they're quoting basically the hadith, his sayings, the prophetic sayings. They're quoting also the Quran, the Holy Scripture itself, as their inspiration. So there's very clear verses that talk about the importance of making sure that those who are not mentally well are actually taken care of, right? So that's a very clear kind of mandate by the faith itself. And then you have prophetic sayings, especially the very clear mandate of the Prophet Muhammad to actually build the hospitals. So you see that first, the very first of the meristands are mobile units that move around, and then they eventually become these fixed structures, and then they really expand and grow. And so there's these quotes that they're quoting, as well as saying the faith itself is very oriented to mind, body, soul. It has this very holistic sense of well-being. And there's teachings that say, don't look at this just from a disease lens. It's not just illness, but it is partly that. And there's these prophetic sayings that say, if God has sent down an illness, he's also sent a cure or a treatment. So seek them out, right? It's a very clear mandate to seek out treatments, including psychiatric illnesses. It's not discriminating here. And then you see the other holistic aspects of don't just look at illness, make sure you're also treating someone's soul or spirit, making sure you're also focusing on physical and cognition, making sure that their diet is balanced along with their physical well-being and mental well-being. So you see that's very holistic. And then you see that kind of showing itself in the institutions, these Maristans, the healing centers, hospitals that they built.
Give me some examples of how you are combining those principles with new science, with medication
Yes.
and therapies.
Yeah, definitely. It's and you asked about the teaching tool too, and this is exactly where it's been so useful. I feel like the work we do at my lab and my own kind of research has been to bridge a lot of bridging. It's reminding people what the history is. A lot of it is corrective. It's rewriting a narrative. It's also fixing that Eurocentric narrative that didn't just exclude kind of the Muslims, but also excluded kind of ancient Chinese medicine, ancient Indian medicine. I mean, there's many civilizations that have contributed. So it's very historical, educational. And then there's the revival piece. The revival piece for me is we need to bridge to modern day science. There's so many advancements in the field of psychiatry, psychology that can't be ignored. And we don't want to go backwards, we want to go forward. So a lot of what I find myself today doing is let's educate and correct the narrative. And let's see where we're bridging because there's so many things that make a lot of sense today. Like today, most therapists, one of the main things they're going to prescribe to their patients, clients, is meditation. Well, that's part and parcel of the Islamic tradition. But let's make sure that we actually allow for meditation that is in tune with this particular faith tradition, because the kind of meditation that's available today comes typically from a Buddhist background and then secularized, kind of a mindfulness meditation model, which is very powerful and helpful, but it doesn't have other meditation models. So, needless to say, our newest book is actually working on that, for example. But these teaching tools become really important because then you have very practical ways of how you integrate faith based aspects into modern clinical therapy. And also, like you said, with medications, which for me, as a psychiatrist specifically, I'm always telling people that I'm teaching and my own patients there is nothing contradicting taking medications from the Islamic tradition. In fact, we have very clear mandates to take medicine and clear proofs that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his community, whenever they fell ill, they took medicine by mouth, right? Like actual medicine, even for emotional or mental health conditions.
Would you talk a little bit more then about some of in your practice? You are a clinician, you see patients.
Yeah.
The other cultural obstacles that you see, do you see a gender divide in the Muslim community in terms of seeking treatment or feeling comfortable seeking it?
There's a lot more women who come to therapy than men, but I think that's pretty universal,
I've
unfortunately.
heard that from
That's pretty
several
universal.
faculty members, but yes.
Yes.
But I mean,
Yes.
are there particulars? I don't want to make an assumption about another's culture and tradition, so that's why I'm
Mhm.
asking for understanding purposes. What are some of the things that you're finding
Yeah.
that you need to bridge?
Yeah, definitely. When I go have a new patient at Stanford and I go to the waiting room and I call out the name of the person so that they come back, to the room, it's very obvious sometimes from their name or from how they're, maybe they wear hijab, for example, such as how I dress, right? So I can tell that they're Muslim, but I'm very specific and very particular in that I don't say the Muslim greeting, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, when I meet somebody for the first time. And I'm always called out for this whenever I go back into, we walk back to my office, we go into the room, shut the door, and and often patients are like, Dr. Awad, I thought you're a Muslim. How come you didn't say the greetings? And I'll say, because I don't want to assume anything. I don't know for you if religion is helpful or harmful to you. I don't know where you're standing on this. And so that usually helps people just sort of I give that little spiel in the beginning. And I feel people I see them kind of their shoulders go down a little, they relax a little. And then there's a sense of what do you want? For some people, they really, really want to have their faith integrated into into therapy. So we talk about how that might look. And for others, it's the opposite. And for the ones who do want faith integrated, we wrote a book called Introducing Traditionally Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy, or the TIIP model. It's a whole model of psychotherapy, of how it is that we integrate Islamic principles, faith based principles, into modern psychotherapy. And so a lot of times it'll be things that we might talk about in the field, like we have this whole concepts of like flourishing, or maybe it's about wellness and well-being. These are the terms that the field uses, but there's equivalent terms within the Islamic tradition, for example. And I already gave the example of meditation, right? There's certain concepts that we say, hey, when you're feeling like your things are really turbulent, try meditation. But we talk about it from the Islamic perspective. So there's a lot of this translation work and this bridging back and forth. And then there's other new concepts, different concepts, um, you know, but we take the lead from the patient. So if the patient says, I pray and I find prayer helpful, then we incorporate that. I'll ask, do you want that to be incorporated into your treatment plan here? Yes, I do. Then we'll actually talk about that. That's pretty unique. That doesn't typically happen at a
Mm-hmm.
typical therapist office, right? But I never push that or insinuate that. It's really what they bring into the room that they want and ask for, then it gets incorporated in. And I think a lot of people appreciate that approach.
I think that would be appreciated by anyone seeking therapy,
Yes.
especially for the first time.
Yes.
You know, you mentioned the gender divide. You know, more women come into therapy, and I think you, as you said, it's probably true across the board. You've also done a lot of specific focus work with women and mental health needs,
Yes.
and you have written on Muslim women's mental health and their beliefs. What's your takeaway in the needs of women in this day and age in Western culture, but also with the overlay of having an Islamic tradition?
Right. Yeah. There are a number of cultural misunderstandings, and this is broadly. I mean, American culture, other cultures, as women, we often push ourselves quite a bit, and we're nurturers kind of by nature. And so we're always giving, 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 but not taking quite enough time to really take what we need for ourselves. We see this in pregnancy all the time. Everyone's really worried about, the baby, but not really taking necessarily focused on their own health and well-being. I find that there's a lot of misunderstandings of things, particularly like postpartum depression or peripartum depression. There's a lot of judgment. This is not unique to just the Muslims, but really all people. But I see this very often with women I work with, especially women of faith, because there's often this sense of like, how dare I be depressed when God just gave me this blessing of a child.
Mm.
There's so many people who can't have a child or can't have a baby, and here I have a healthy baby and I'm crying and depressed. And a lot of education around hormones and hormonal shifting, and how most of the time this is biological. This is a biological condition. And if it's not treated in time, we worry about postpartum psychosis, and then things get really, really out of hand. And then the shame and the guilt that comes with it is often what I find myself talking to women, and depending on their cultural lens and their worldview. And sometimes faith becomes really important here. Just sometimes this it takes a while to treat. And for many people from a faith tradition, they lean on their faith to get through this and know that, it's not that God is punishing them or God is upset with them, but these are themes that we're often talking through.
That's so profound for everybody, but particularly a culture or a group that's embedded in a larger Western culture.
Right.
And that brings me to some of the special pressures that the Muslim community likely is facing. Well, I know they're facing bigotry,
Hmm.
as with
Hmm.
other minority groups,
Right.
LGBTQ and women. And
Right.
there's fear, there's trepidation, I would assume, of feeling targeted by some. And then there's the larger global conflicts, the situation with refugees and the
Yes.
utter devastation in places like Gaza. And so I need to ask you about the collective toll, and
Mhm.
as well as the personal toll, maybe the collective grief.
Absolutely. And there is collective grief. And it would be really the elephant in the room if we didn't name that, you know. So I'm glad to be able to do so. And yes, this is where some of the more difficult parts of the research that I do and the work that I do come up. We have a whole line of research in my lab, just as we do on the history and just as we do on women's health, is on Islamophobia, right? Kind of naming it. Some years ago, I published a book, as a co-editor of a book called Islamophobia and Psychiatry, and it was really the first time in print, in academic literature, that there was this connection made between Islamophobia, like identity-based discrimination on someone's faith tradition, and the detrimental effects on mental health. And that's really, now it's been highly cited and whatnot. And I'm glad for that, because everything we had up until that point was anecdotal. We knew as a community this was happening, but couldn't really put our finger and say, this is the detrimental effect. Things like school age children and bullying based on their identity. So, the most recent research found that over 50% of Muslim school age children will um, will experience identity-based Islamophobic discrimination, and it might be their name, it might be what they're eating at lunch, it might be how they're dressed, something that sets them apart, and that is twice more than the next faith group over. And so, as a parent myself, as I send my kids out into the world, like I am very cognizant of that. And so you carry this burden with you everywhere you go, whether you might experience discrimination yourself or that your kid might, that sometimes there's these peaks, unfortunately, where they happen typically around election cycles, where it's just the Islamophobia really kind of peaks. And that becomes very hard collectively on the entire community. And then, as you said, there's the global conflicts. So that this is national right here, and then there's the global kind of knowing that Muslims in other parts of the world are ailing and hurting, and that there seems to be little you can do other than pray, and then try to, help in whatever charitable causes potentially. The refugee crisis has been a big one. My own little spiritual journey I was doing in my adolescence at 20, and a lot of that was in Syria before the war. So when the war happened in Syria, I felt very compelled to help in some way, some capacity, to a group of people. I'm not Syrian, so it was, I felt like they gave me so much, I wanted to give back. I ended up doing a lot of work with Syrian refugees in Jordan and in Turkey and just in other countries wherever they were, as living as refugees, and not having enough support, particularly mental health support. So we did a lot of train the trainers, but it's something that's like you carry and you want to give back in some way. And I feel like most people that I talk to, they have the same feeling, right? they're carrying their own personal worries and potential discrimination, and they're carrying this other burden of like wanting to help their sisters and brothers. That's how we refer to it in the Islamic faith. These are my Muslim sisters and brothers in other parts of the world. And how do I do so?
Resources are so important, and you've done so much work putting resources together and participating. I was reading about the local crisis response team, the Bay Area Muslim Mental Health Crisis Response Team.
Yeah,
Tell us what they do.
it started because when I entered into the field, I didn't know who else was a Muslim in mental health around me. Then I just sort of put the call out into the world and said, "Hey, if you're a Muslim and in mental health, we're going to meet here at Stanford on this day." I remember the very first meeting, the three of us just sort of looked at each other and, "Do you know each other? No, do you know each other?" And by the next month there were like double that amount, and by the next month, and we eventually grew into like a group of over 100 mental health professionals who are Muslim identified. But most people didn't even know each other. It's like everybody felt that they were on islands all by themselves. And then we started to figure out everybody's different expertise. Some people are trauma informed, some are do DBT and CBT work, others are working in cultural mental health. And so we figured out, well, the community's experiencing various tragedies or crises that come up. So we formed a crisis response team, and a couple unfortunate incidents happened. There was a very sad, two Muslim students from UC Santa Cruz had drowned
Yes.
as they were just, playing by the, having a good time on the way. So that was very, very sad for the community. So we did kind of a healing circle. There was an unfortunate tragedy at the time of when the Palo Alto suicide contagion was happening.
Yes.
One of those students was Muslim, and that really was upsetting, of course, to the community. That's actually how my start in a lot of the suicide work that I do started. And I realized, oh, wow, like we don't have enough resources that are congruent and sensitive to this particular community. And that launched a whole line of research in my lab on the topic of suicide. But the crisis response team was very useful because we were able to, within 24 hours of the tragedy, pull the community together, do a community healing circle, do a grief support, offer one on one support, particularly for the friends and the family of the victim, right? The person who died by suicide. And that led to other measures as well. We have a Bay Area Muslim Mental Health Community Advisory Board. They're actually made up of some mental health professionals, but mostly community members, community leaders who have their ears to the community from the East Bay, the South Bay, the North Bay, kind of all coming together from different geographical and ethnic backgrounds and kind of advising on Muslim mental health issues. There's now a website called Bay Area Muslim Therapists.org that kind of collected all of these different clinicians on one website. So when people say, I don't know where to go for help, that's how they could find them all. And then a couple of Muslim mental health clinics that I've been involved with. First, the Khalil Center, now Maristan, that are specified uh, to help really anybody from any walk of life, but their niche specialty is in Muslim mental health. So they're all Muslim clinician therapists who then offer Islamically integrated or at least culturally congruent mental health care.
And your lab, which is collecting all of this vital information and trains others. Tell us what else goes on in your lab.
Yeah, I talked about how I was really keen on having this pathways program. We have these 25 to 30 or even 35 mentees every year. They're all hoping to go into either psychology, psychiatry. And we basically position this with the different lines of research. I have 7 lines of research in my lab. I mentioned a few of them already, the historical line, the Islamic psychology line, the refugee mental health, global mental health line. There's a line specifically on suicide. Our newest line of research is on addictions, and then CBPR, community-based participatory research line, and a social justice line. So these different lines of research produce the work, the research that is needed. From there, all of this is published as a lab would, in academic medical journals. But then there is another arm to the work we do, and that's where the nonprofit organization was formed, Maristan, 3 years ago. And what Maristan is actually named after the hospitals in the Muslim world, right?
Yes.
Um, and what the nonprofit does is basically, everything that is academically produced and published in my lab needs to still be translated over to what could be more accessible and disseminated to Muslim communities across the country and really across the globe now. For example, on the line of suicide, we have this very robust manual that we created on all the cutting edge research, scientific research on suicide. And then bridged within that manual is also all the Islamic ethics, morals, legal rulings related to suicide. Maristan then came, took the manual, which is available to all, but they took this manual and then created from it a full day training program, modules now used to train Muslim religious leaders, imams, and community leaders. So there's like these partnerships that we formed from the lab to the nonprofit and to other groups to make sure a lot of the research and work we do doesn't just die in the dark corners, unless they're really actually taken and disseminated out to the community and they're made useful and beneficial to the public. Things that really help people understand and relate to the mental health research we're doing.
Certainly directed toward the Muslim community, but I'm assuming that any community leader or anyone that has interaction with the many different kinds of people we're lucky enough to have in this country would find resources here.
Yes, there's so much of the work we do is very relevant to even for other faith-based communities or even other minority and marginalized communities. So much of the work overlaps and can be scaled to those communities as well.
We have to wrap up, but I would like you to take this opportunity to extend a message to anyone listening of the Muslim community about seeking mental health and this integration of the Islamic tradition.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And my aim in all of this is to bridge people to good quality care and make it accessible and relevant to them. And so for those who might be Muslim identified who are listening and wondering about, should I seek out help for myself or my family members? Is this even in tune, in line with my own tradition? I want to reassure you that not only is it, but that Muslims have always been on the forefront of anything that's considered holistic well-being. And mental health was no exception. So this is your tradition. This is your heritage. Reclaim it. And lastly, I would say for those who are not Muslim identified but are finding this kind of interesting and fascinating, I hope that you and everyone will join us in this dream that I have to literally revive the concept of the Meristan in the modern era, bringing together all the modern advancements we have, but in the most holistic way. I think the world today, particularly after the pandemic, and the field itself is moving in that direction. So I'm hopeful people will join me in this dream going forward.
Dr. Rania Awaad, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate the time here.
Well, Dr. Awaad has given us a bounty of information and resources in that packed conversation. You'll find them all listed in the program notes of this episode, including links to more of the books, the talks, and the research of Stanford Psychiatry clinical professor, director of the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, and University Affiliate Chaplain, Dr. Rania Awaad. As always, we're grateful you spent this time with us on What Makes Up Your Mind. Come back again. I'm Jane McMillan. You've been listening to What Makes Up Your Mind. Updates from the frontiers of neuroscience, well-being, and mental health from the experts in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine. For more information on this program and all of our transformational work, visit us at med.stanford.edu/psychiatry. What Makes Up Your Mind? Updates from the Frontiers of Neuroscience, Well-Being, and Mental Health is a production of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University School of Medicine, a copyright of the Board of Trustees of Stanford University.